Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining the Wisconsin Veterans Museum today for our last book talk of the month of March. I see a few of you are still connecting to audio, so we'll give everybody just another moment or two. We still have people coming into the waiting room as well. Fantastic. Well, we always welcome a nice big audience. I'd just like to remind everybody today as well that we do have our security features enabled, so nobody will be able to unmute themselves or start their video. So if you have any questions for our author today, please submit them directly to me via the chat function here on Zoom. And also, I would be remiss if I did not mention that this event, of course, is sponsored by the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation, with support for the foundation coming in memory of Pat Finley. So thank you again to the Finley family and to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support in all of our virtual programming, not just our book talks, but our trivia night, which is coming up tomorrow night. Don't forget to register, and all the other great virtual programs that we do here at the museum. Today, our guest is Dr. Mark Moyar. Dr. Moyar joined Hillsdale College in 2021 as the William P. Harris Chair in Military History. And from 2018 to 2019, he served as the director of the Office of Civilian Military Cooperation at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Previously, he directed a project on military and diplomatic history at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And he's also taught at the U.S. Marine Corps University, Joint Special Operations University, and Texas A&M University as well. He's the author of 7 books on military history, diplomatic history, grand strategy, leadership, and international development. And his articles have been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, as well as other various publications. Dr. Moyar holds a BA summa cum laude from Harvard and a PhD from Cambridge, and he's here to talk to us today about his newest work, Triumph Regained, the Vietnam War, 1965 to 1968. Dr. Moyar, welcome.
Thanks very much for having me, Eric. It's great to be here with you and the veteran community.
Outstanding. If you're all set, the floor is all yours, sir, and I'm going to go ahead and let you give your presentation.
Okay, let me just make sure we've got the slideshow running. Can you see the first slide?
Yeah, there it is right there. Perfect.
Okay, good. Well, I have some slides, mostly images to talk about, but yes, so, let me first start off with the big picture question that, why do we care so much about Vietnam, and why I've spent so much time on this. And I did previously do a book on the Phoenix program, and then I did a book on the 54 to 65 period called Triumph Forsaken. And then the new one is Triumph Regained. It picks up in the middle of 65 and goes through the end of the Johnson administration. But I think fundamentally, historians are still wrestling with this question of what exactly the Vietnam War was. Was it, as we have one version there from John Kerry, the biggest nothing in history, or was it, as Ronald Reagan said, a noble cause? And certainly assessing that question has been one of the main reasons I've been so interested, because this is an important part of our nation's history, and I think figuring out which of these views is more accurate is important to us as a country. I also like to talk about who actually is writing, who's been writing the history. And I liked Vietnam as a topic because there was a lot of uncharted territory, and there also seemed to be a lot of distortion, I think. And as I've studied it, I think a lot of the inaccuracies of the history of Vietnam are the result of the fact that veterans themselves didn't write much of it. It was mostly written by people who avoided going to Vietnam. And this is a quote from Michael Medved that I think is quite telling. And he was a student at Yale during the war and opposed the war. And one thing too, and I talk about this in a new book, and that Medved himself talks about, is that there isn't much opposition to the war until 1967, when the draft rules changed. That's what this little newspaper clip here is. But they changed the rules so it was hard to get draft exemptions. So suddenly there's this surge, and as Medved says, was sort of, people did not want to go to the military, and this is why they didn't oppose the war. It wasn't the other way around. And then here we see, how the generation that's protesting here will come out again in 2003 in the Iraq War as professors, and these are the professors who've written much of the history for us. Also think it's worth looking at the broader moral context of the war in terms of what was at stake, because this, I think, oftentimes gets lost, especially on the younger generations who sometimes think socialism and communism aren't that bad. But this is a struggle in a century where communism killed about 100 million people, and I think you can't study Vietnam without understanding that moral context. So I'll start off talking here mainly about where the previous volume leaves off. In early 1965, North Vietnam launches what they think is going to be a decisive offensive, and Lyndon Johnson had given them reason to think that he was going to let them get away with this, because he talked in the '64 election about how he wasn't going to send American boys to Vietnam, and he wasn't a warmonger like Barry Goldwater. And there's a number of other factors too going on there, and relating to the 1963 coup, which I considered a huge disaster. So right after Johnson beats Goldwater in November of '64, the North Vietnamese launch what they consider to be an offensive to destroy South Vietnam and take the whole country over. And they are quite effective, starting in May of '65, inflict heavy damage on the South Vietnamese, and basically forces Lyndon Johnson to decide whether or not he is going to send American troops to save the day. So Johnson does, in fact, decide that in July of '65 that he is going to send in American ground troops. He thinks that the political stakes are too important, that stopping communism in Asia requires stopping it in South Vietnam. And the first big operation is the first big combat contact is Operation Starlight in August of '65, where the Marines surprise some communist forces and defeat them soundly. And this is a critical battle. Doesn't get as much attention as some of the others, but actually probably the most significant in terms of convincing North Vietnam that they're not going to be able to win this decisive victory. You then have the Battle of Ia Drang Valley, which many of you are probably familiar with from the book We Were Soldiers Once and Young, the movie We Were Soldiers. And here again, you have superior American firepower, and mobility allows a smaller American force to defeat large, concentrated North Vietnamese army units. Now, something else is going on here that you almost certainly haven't heard about in other histories of Vietnam, but I devote considerable attention to what's going on in Indonesia in 1965, because it has everything to do with what the United States is trying to accomplish in Vietnam. And it turns out that, and we saw earlier in the year, in early '65, the Indonesian military is talking to the Americans about how they should make a stand in Vietnam. So it comes to a head in September of 1965. Sukarno there is a communist, essentially, who is moving the country into open alliance with China, and he decides, together with the Indonesian Communist Party, to launch a putsch where they will essentially wipe out the top level of the army leadership because they are considered to be anti-communist. So they stage this event on the night of September 30th, and they capture and kill all but one of their targets. One of them escapes, but they don't go after this gentleman on the right, Suharto. And they don't go after him because they think he is an opportunist who's just going to go whichever way the wind blows. It turns out that's a fairly accurate assessment, because what happens is Suharto doesn't immediately decide what he's going to do, but he happens to be near the capital with a sizable number of troops. So what he does is he contacts the other commanders in the Indonesian military who are nearby to see who would be with him in standing up to the communists. And enough of them ultimately come out against the communists that he is moved into action. And there's a lot of evidence, including from Suharto himself, that the decision of these generals to move against Sukarno was deeply influenced by Vietnam, because Vietnam showed them the United States was not getting out of Asia. So this is perhaps the single most important strategic benefit that the United States will get out of Vietnam. And Suharto will go on to crush the Indonesian Communist Party, kick Sukarno out, and Indonesia becomes a crucial Cold War ally for the US. And this is also relevant as we think of the longer term context. You know, Indonesia is now has been a key ally in our ongoing competition with China, and China, again today, of course, being now our main strategic rival. So something else that comes out of Vietnam that people often don't consider as a result of Vietnam is the great proletarian cultural revolution in China. So what does this have to do with Vietnam? Well, Mao, early in 1965, up until the middle of 65, thinks that things are going swimmingly for him. It looks like South Vietnam is about to fall to the North Vietnamese, and it looks like the communists are going to take over completely in Indonesia. But U.S. comes in and stops the first thing, the Vietnam, the conquest of Vietnam, and then Sukarno, as I mentioned, is thwarted. So after these two disastrous defeats, these defeats encourage Mao to shift away from international revolution and towards internal revolution. And as you may know, they go after all sorts of perceived enemies internally, many of them actually in the Communist Party. It's a bit of a massive witch hunt, probably several million people killed. And this will debilitate China. It will wreck its economy, its military, and turn it away from international revolution for quite some time. The Cultural Revolution and also just Vietnam itself will split the Chinese and Soviets further apart. Because of the American air war against the North Vietnamese have to rely more on the Soviets for anti-aircraft weaponry. And this in turn fuels jealousy with the Chinese, because the Chinese are concerned that this is now giving the Soviets greater leverage and will lead to further clashes, and will eventually also lead to falling out between China and Hanoi. The Soviets, they're very uncomfortable with what's going on and don't like the fact that they're being pushed into this conflict more deeply. And so we see a lot of pressure from them from early on to negotiate with the Americans to try to find some resolution to this war. Now, at the same time, you have Lyndon Johnson is facing pressure to negotiate. You see here Robert F. Kennedy, J. William Fulbright, a couple of those who are most vocal in asking him to do this. And Johnson himself he's a bit reluctant. He is making efforts to negotiate, but the North Vietnamese don't seem to be all that interested in negotiating. But he will continue to face a lot of criticism for not being more accommodating to the North Vietnamese. So this is one of many interesting quotes I've found. Both the last book and this book, I make heavy use of North Vietnamese sources that people haven't seen before. But this is a really, I think, telling quote as to what the North really thinks about this whole negotiating business. So Ho Chi Minh here is saying, our immediate goal is to make the enemy end the bombing of North Vietnam so that we can transport supplies to help South Vietnam and make preparations to launch more powerful attacks. So in other words, their whole idea of pushing negotiations, and a big part of that is the ending of the bombing of North, which they say will lead to negotiations. In fact, this is all a trick. They're telling the Americans to stop the bombing and we'll negotiate, but they're really saying stop the bombing and we will go increase our attacks in South Vietnam. After the initial American incursion or intervention, and the North decides that it is unable to win decisively, it turns towards a war of attrition. The man on the left, General Nguyen Chi Thanh, is the chief architect of North Vietnamese strategy at this time. And he is intent on fighting sizable battles against the Americans to inflict casualties and wear down American will, much as the Viet Minh had worn down the will of the French in 1954. On the right, General Bon Nguyen Giap, who many people thought at the time was running things, he's actually no longer the dominant figure he had been in the 1950s. And he is actually a critic of the approach being taken. He argues that this actually plays in American hands, but launching these big attacks, because that's how the Americans are best capable of fighting, and that they should instead rely more on guerrilla warfare. But Giap will not be heeded for some time. Now, on the American side, you also have a war of attrition. General Westmoreland shown there. He's the strategic mastermind on the U.S. side, and he also is in favor of attrition. He's less convinced that he can destroy the enemy's will, but instead is more focused on destroying the enemy's capabilities, and that will then be a means to allow the South Vietnamese to get back on their feet. We see 66 and 67 intensification of the war, rising casualties on both sides as both are focused on attrition of the opponent. And another important finding in this book is that we've been told a lot about the so-called body count issue, and that Westmoreland was focused too much on the body count, and in addition that the Americans inflated the body count, and so really we were doing a terrible job and not even really understanding it. Now, again, from the North Vietnamese side, their histories indicate that no, in fact, the Americans are fighting very effectively. They are inflicting enormous losses, and that General Westmoreland's strategy is actually pretty effective. We also know, and this is perhaps even more interesting, that the North Vietnamese leadership and General Nguyen Chi Thanh they actually themselves are the ones who don't really have a firm grasp on what's going and are receiving exaggerated statistics. And the North Vietnamese, as they suffer these massive defeats in the South, they start claiming that they're killing more Americans than they really are, because that will make them look better. If you lose 500 of your troops, it's better to say you were able to kill 500 Americans as opposed to the 50 Americans you actually did kill. And so for some time that the North Vietnamese will be operating under a mistaken notion that their war in the South is succeeding, when it's really not. We also, in this period, there's a lot of frustration on the US side, because while things are going reasonably well in the South, the enemy is still able to compensate for all its losses by sending in more troops from North Vietnam, and they send them through Laos and Cambodia. So you have some of the nation's most important figures, Eisenhower there on the left, General Earl Wheeler, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the right, who keep telling Johnson he needs to move beyond South Vietnam with American power, send American troops into Laos, Cambodia, either send troops into North Vietnam or intensify the bombing of North Vietnam, because otherwise we're in the situation where the enemy is just going to be able to keep sending more troops in and into a rather difficult environment in South Vietnam. These arguments are countered by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and he argues that no, we actually want to limit ourselves in the way that we're doing this, and that these proposed actions outside the country are not going to help that much, and they're going to dangerously provoke the Soviets and the Chinese. So the intelligence community's position on this is generally more favorable towards what Eisenhower and General Wheeler are saying than what McNamara is saying. And so you have the intelligence community here in that box. This is one example. This is looking at what would happen if the United States escalate in Vietnam. It says there would be a good chance that the Soviets would at this juncture begin to exert greater efforts to bring about peace. They would have to weigh the risks of some level of confrontation with the U.S. against their reluctance to put real pressure on Hanoi for a political solution. So essentially that, in fact, if we want to bring the enemy to the negotiating table, we should take these more expansive measures. But McNamara rejects that and in fact creates his own intelligence estimate, which says the opposite. And it's not even produced by intelligence people, but by policy officials, which is not really how things are supposed to work. We've seen then from post-war sources that in fact, McNamara was wrong on multiple counts. These actions, in fact, would have made the war, put the U.S. in a much more advantageous strategic position. And we hear from the Soviets, and this is on the left, Anatoly Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador to the U.S., and on the right, Premier Zhu Enlai. And they both indicate that, in fact, even had the U.S. taken these actions beyond South Vietnam, that they were not going to get involved in a war with the United States. The Soviets view that as antithetical to their interests. The Chinese believed that they had taken such a horrific beating in the Korean War, and combat was so lopsided that they didn't want any part of another war like this. In fact, the North Vietnamese will become rather angry at them because the Chinese are actually making pretty clear that they're not going to go into Vietnam to fight. As far as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, this is one of a number of sources we have talking about how the use of American ground troops on the Ho Chi Minh Trail would have really changed the nature of the game. And the Soviets said they really are not keen on this whole war. They think it's sucking up resources. So they actually tell the United States in June '65, surreptitiously, how the U.S. can win the war. Rather remarkable, because they're basically our enemy in this whole thing. But they said, increase your force by 5 divisions and seal off the 17th parallel, cut off the Viet Cong from their northern logistics. But here, again, the Americans don't buy this advice. Tragic consequences. The dissatisfaction with McNamara mounts, especially as a result of the bombing campaign, because he imposed this concept of gradual escalation, which is intended to increase our bargaining power by starting off at a low level of bombing. And the theory is that as you go up gradually, that gives us the opportunity to at some point raise those stakes further, and that this will increase our bargaining leverage. And this is based heavily on academic theory and had very little actual factual undergirding to it. And clearly, it's not doing what Americans are hoping, and the military is becoming known that the military has been calling for much more intensive bombing. So finally, in fall of '67, Senator John Stennis summons Robert McNamara to a hearing to talk about the bombing, and he also brings in a bunch of generals, and the generals make clear that they have been telling McNamara that the bombing needs to be intensified and that McNamara has been ignoring them. So McNamara then pulls out what has been his foremost defense of the bombing strategy, which is that essentially the military value of bombing is not that important, and it's really more a psychological and symbolic effort. And to show that it's really not military important, he says that no matter how much we bomb North Vietnam, it's not going to affect their ability to support the war. And he brings in these numbers. He says the North Vietnamese, to keep up their present level of combat, need to move 75 tons per day to South Vietnam, and the infiltration system in North Vietnam can carry 200 tons per day. So even if we bomb some more, they might get down to 150 or 100, but they'd still be able to do whatever they need to do. This also proves to be false, and I found some information here which has not been discovered previously about what's actually going on with North Vietnamese logistics. So, McNamara is saying there's all this excess capacity, so it doesn't matter if we bomb. Well, we now can see from enemy sources that they don't have any excess capacity. In fact, they are frequently unable to conduct military operations because they lack logistical supplies. Battle of Dak To is an excellent case in point. This is a major battle. The North Vietnamese have to delay an entire year to stockpile the weapons and ammunition and food they need for this battle. We also have in September of 1967 another stunning revelation, and this event is actually an outgrowth of the Stennis hearings, because when finally the Senate is calling on the administration to explain itself and there's growing discontent with gradual escalation, Johnson authorizes some new bombing to deflate the critics. So he does open new targets to bombing that have been bombed before, and lo and behold, Hanoi comes under unprecedented stress. Hanoi is brought really to the brink of starvation because of the supply problems. And this quote here is from the British Consul General who was in Hanoi at the time, and he says the country and its people were close to a collapse, which for the first time, no amount of excited exhortation could correct. Now, at this point, the North Vietnamese pull one of their one more trick out of their bag that they've used before, which is just argue that they will negotiate if the Americans will stop the bombing, and the Americans fall for it again. Bombing is reduced near Hanoi, and Hanoi is able to recover. And of course, the North Vietnamese do not negotiate in good faith at all. Now, we've heard that one of the big faults of the United States is that it was too impatient in Vietnam, and the enemy was supremely patient. And if only we known this, we would have not been so foolish. But truth is that the North Vietnamese themselves are very impatient. And by 1967, they are realizing that they've been getting lied to about how things are going in the South, that they are getting walloped militarily, and therefore they have to do something different. And Le Duan, who is here now the leading strategist in North Vietnam, says, all right, we're going to do something different. What we're going to do is we're going to attack the urban areas of South Vietnam, and enemy won't be expecting it. And the people in South Vietnam are ready to rise up in revolution because they're being oppressed by these terrible South Vietnamese puppets and their American masters. And so this is what will become the Tet Offensive of 1968. Now, the Tet Offensive is, as I'm sure many of you know, some of you witnessed firsthand, their surprise is achieved, but there is no popular uprising. The people, most of them either just hide or they actually help the South Vietnamese forces. Many of them have relatives in the South Vietnamese government. And this, the North Vietnamese are further at a disadvantage in that they are trying to hold territory, which they don't usually do. And when they do that, then they expose themselves to South Vietnamese and American firepower. And it proves to be just a tremendously devastating defeat in pretty much all places. But there is some propaganda value they get, such as from the picture in the lower left there, the shooting of this Viet Cong prisoner who, which again, not really any context provided. And the photographer who took it, Eddie Adams, later said this was sort of horrific how the media handled this, that they assumed that somehow this showed we were on the wrong side. But this fellow had actually just killed a bunch of South Vietnamese civilians, and he was also wearing civilian clothing, which is against how warfare is to be conducted. Khe Sanh, here's another big myth that I go after in Triumph Regained. We've been told that Khe Sanh was a diversion, and again, these wily North Vietnamese just conducted a feint there to take America's eyes away from the cities. And so Westmoreland and others were just stupid because they focused on it. And North Vietnamese sources, again, confound this interpretation and show us, in fact, no, this was something they were very much trying to get. And this is a quote from one of their commanders, and he's saying the primary objectives, and I'll just skip through this, but to liberate Khe Sanh is listed as one of the objectives. They thought it was going to be another Dien Bien Phu, similar in 1954. And of course, there's also other factors that indicate it was not a feint. They sent over 40,000 troops there to take it, which you would not have done had this been just some kind of diversionary attack. And of course, they get crushed there in massive numbers. Now, after the Tet Offensive, March of '68, Lyndon Johnson goes on the air to announce that he is not going to run for re-election. And he also talks about suspending American airstrikes and negotiations. And this is taken usually as indication that the U.S. is basically planning now to divest itself of Vietnam. But the truth on this, too, is rather different. We see new commander coming in, General Creighton Abrams. He's certainly not trying to get America out. And Lyndon Johnson is not cutting American troops out at this point. Troop numbers will not go down during the rest of his term. And the bombing he authorizes or restricts is basically in areas that they couldn't bomb anyway because of weather. And there's a big controversy too over whether Abrams was a radical departure from Westmoreland. There's some people who argue that quite strenuously that Abrams came in with a new strategy and tactics that were much better than Westmoreland. But what I found is that Abrams, when he first comes in, says we're doing exactly what we should be doing with as far as tactics and the so-called search and destroy operations, where you go after enemy forces. And it's only later, when conditions have changed, that Abrams will actually shift attention to pacification. The Tet Offensive is pretty well known in the West, but what happens the remainder of the year is much less well known. People have sometimes talked about a mini Tet offensives in May and August of '68, but don't go into much detail. And the term doesn't really do justice, because these are also very large offensives. And really remarkably, in both cases, the North Vietnamese try to do the same thing they did in January of 1968. They go after the urban areas. And then Lê Duan, orders in May of '68, tells the commanders, we're going to go back in to attack all these cities, and this time it's going to work great. And the commanders say, well, we're not going to have the element of surprise. We really got clobbered last time. And he says, well, no, we're going to do it. So they do it, fails in May, and then he does the same thing again in August. And by this point, a lot of the North Vietnamese commanders are telling him this is a terrible idea, but Lê Duan has no real interest in listening to them, and they get crushed yet a third time, and at this point are really in great disarray. And had Lê Duan not been in complete control of the country, he would have been, I think, certainly kicked out. It's a little bit like Vladimir Putin in Russia has been able to stay in power despite a lot of militarily disastrous decisions. It's after the defeat of the third wave offensive that pacification can really get going under Abrams. And in November, the Americans and South Vietnamese start what they call the accelerated pacification campaign. And this involves breaking troops into smaller units, since there's no longer much of a threat of big enemy units. And they go in to retake areas, a lot of which had been occupied by the communists for some time. And they actually find the communist presence is basically nil in a lot of these places because of these disastrous offensives early in the year, that people were taken out of the countryside to participate in these, and they got wiped out. So this is extremely successful endeavor. Now, as the battlefield's turning for the better, the home front is becoming more difficult for the Johnson administration. You have the anti-war movement getting larger. As I mentioned, at '67, it really gains a lot of impetus from on college campuses, and we see larger and larger demonstrations. Now, the sort of mythology of Vietnam is that this was a mass popular movement that really helped reshape the war, but at the time they were really despised by most Americans. Even a lot of liberals who opposed the war did not care for the anti-war movement because they were radical. They were destroying property and spitting on police and doing all sorts of stuff, and to some extent actually helped sustain support for the war. We don't hear nearly as much from historians about those who were supporting the war, but in fact there are some very large rallies that take place during this period, and also just in terms of the numbers and voting, support for the war is still very strong, which we've heard that American support for the war declines after the Tet Offensive. Not quite true. This is one of the most interesting things I've found on the subject of public opinion. This is last real poll we have in '68 about what people think we should do in Vietnam. And you would think from reading most of what we have that by this time 70%, 80% of Americans are tired of Vietnam. They want to get out, or at least more than 50%. But this shows here percent of people who want to get out of Vietnam altogether is just 13%. So clearly this is not a nation that is decided to throw in the towel at this point. There's other options here about various ways to continue the war. Some want escalation, some want to just keep it the same, some want to start turning things over, but there is not any large-scale settlement to bail out. This fact is particularly important in light of the fact that Lyndon Johnson is not making much of an effort at all to sell the war to the American people. And he will, in 1967, basically admit that he was probably wrong in doing this, but he will continue nonetheless. But he says that I have to be careful not to get the country on an anti-communist binge because it tears up what we have gained with the USSR. If history indicts us for Vietnam, it will be for fighting a war without trying to stir up patriotism. So given that there's this absence of presidential leadership, it's all the more remarkable that the American support for the war remains so strong. And another indication of the support for the war is the election of Richard Nixon. And he is known as being one of the nation's toughest anti-communists. And when Hubert Humphrey runs against him in the election, Humphrey does not take an anti-war position because he knows that moderate and conservative voters are not interested in cutting and running. But Nixon will win by a narrow margin and then become president, which will be the topic of my third and final book in this Vietnam War trilogy. Another fact I'd like to point out when we think about the broader strategic context, especially when you hear people talk about how, well, Vietnam, they now aren't as friendly to China and they have moved towards a more capitalist system. And but I think still, even what's happened there, we can see that they are really far behind the other countries that stayed with us. And I think the US certainly could have kept South Vietnam on its side, unfortunately didn't. But if you look at here in terms of the Freedom Index, the two countries that were allied with the US, Taiwan and South Korea, vastly outperform their opposite numbers, China and North Korea. And Vietnam, I think there would have been had there been a South Vietnam and North Vietnam today, I think we would see similar disparities. And if you also look at GDP per capita, again, Taiwan, South Korea, far ahead of their rivals in this regard. And so this is another reason why I think it's fair to say the US was on the right side in many ways. So that's all I have here. There's a lot more I could talk about, but thank you for your attention and I'm glad to answer some questions.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Moyar. Really brought in a different light to what we would normally hear about the war itself. You certainly picked up on some different aspects, I think, and I think that comes through in our questions as well. I'm going to go ahead and bring up my PowerPoint real quick, and we'll get to some of these questions that we have. So the first question, what was the most difficult part in writing this follow-up book, do you think?
Well, part of it was, so the first volume came out in 2006 and got a lot of attention, but also drew a lot of fire from the academic left, which means most of academia these days. If you look at statistics, we have really sort of a one-party state there, and you have very few Vietnam veterans. And so that didn't make life easy from a career standpoint. And so I ended up writing several books in between that stretch this out. I now have a more secure place at Hillsdale College, and so I'm expecting to write the other one sooner. But that probably was the biggest challenge, just in terms of being able to get the time. I did a tremendous amount of research for this one, as for the last one, because I knew it would come under such scrutiny. So I really had to have all the evidence lined up, and the book has a huge number of footnotes, and so far no one's really tried to challenge the conclusions.
And am I correct in reading that you got a lot of your information from the North Vietnamese side for this second book?
That's correct, and that's an interesting part too, because I had a lot of such information in the first volume, Triumph Forsaken, and at the time I was getting the information mainly from a gentleman named Merle Pribino, who had been a U.S. linguist during the war and had retired and had been out looking for North Vietnamese histories and memoirs and had been translating them. Now, since I did that, since the first book, he's been sharing it with other people because some people thought, well, maybe I was getting exclusive access and we can't verify, but he's happily shared that with other people. And the interesting thing is that a lot of people have tried to ignore those instead of recognizing that we now have all this excellent information. I think it's because so much of what the North Vietnamese have to say actually supports the view of the war supporters and those who adhere to what's called the revisionist position, which essentially takes the view that this was a war for a good reason but fought the wrong way, so basically the Ronald Reagan point of view.
Okay, move on to the next question. And you've touched on this. I think we could kind of skip this one. You have plans to write a third book on this topic. You've already said as much. Any idea on some kind of timeline for this third novel?
But it's going to take some time, as I said. I do, very in-depth research, and which I think has been crucial to the success of these books, because the more you do, the more you understand, the more nuance you can get, and just more undiscovered territory you can chart. But it'll take several years to do it, and it will cover the period from 69 to 75 up to the end of the war.
Excellent. With pressure coming from both sides, Western countries and Eastern Bloc countries, to negotiate, why do you think the negotiations didn't achieve their end goal? I know you mentioned something about the North Vietnamese not being honest brokers, but do you think there's a little more to that?
The North Vietnamese, well, certainly when they thought they could win militarily, or when they could convince the Americans to leave, they basically were of the opinion that we don't really have a need to negotiate, although we'll pretend we do to kind of get the Americans to take some pressure off. Ultimately, in the beginning of 73, the negotiations do produce a peace agreement because, well, for a few reasons, and I'll obviously get more into this in the next book. And the North Vietnamese, though, don't, of course, abide by this agreement, will end up invading in 1975. Now, I think the U.S. could have actually saved South Vietnam in 75 had it wished to do so, but Congress stopped that from happening. But certainly there was not a lack of effort on the U.S. part, and it's worth keeping in mind. And we're hearing some of the same talk with Ukraine. The act of wanting to negotiate a peace doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get one. And for the most part, the North Vietnamese wouldn't negotiate unless the U.S. basically agreed to surrender or accept terms that everyone knew would lead to ultimate defeat.
How do you advise people to balance, all the new work that's coming out, especially now that we're at the 50-year anniversary of Vietnam? How do you suggest people balance all this new work against what has been published previously by historians in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s?
Yes, so I would highly encourage people to read some of the newer books, because there is a tremendous amount out there that changes how we think about the history of the Vietnam War. I think there were some books earlier on that I think were very useful. Gunter Louis' American Vietnam in 1978. Philip Davidson wrote a book called Vietnam War around 1989. which I think took issue with some of the sort of conventional wisdom we've been handed down. But the books that kind of been most popular, Stanley Carno's book, David Halberstam's Best and the Brightest, Neil Sheen's Bright Shining Lie, those I think were all deeply flawed. And in Triumph Forsaken, more so than this one, I talk about how the journalistic view got so distorted because the journalists were themselves complicit in this 1963 coup, which didn't go at all as they had predicted. And so they then tried to rewrite the history to support what they are doing. I do think it's a bit unfortunate that, as I said, the the academic left, which has most of the academic positions, have kind of avoided a lot of the new information, and they've steered towards niche topics on very minor issues like gender in American diplomacy, or toxic masculinity in men's magazines, which has not been very helpful. So but there are some other good books. Another really good one came out a number of years ago is Black April by Jay Vyth, which covers the 1975 offensive. Louis Sorley's books are very good, although I think he's a little too critical of Westmoreland, and I think Westmoreland is unfairly blamed for a lot of things.
All right. We did get a last minute question come in as well. We have one of our viewers says, concerning the bombing, had the bombing continued in North Vietnam, principally in Hanoi, might the war have had ended prior to the 68 Tet Offensive, do you think?
Yes, I definitely think that. I mean, we know that they were really in desperate shape by the fall of 67. I think they would probably have agreed to some kind of peace. Now, would they have started up again later? Perhaps. But the only times they really are willing to negotiate is when the North is under very heavy pressure, and we see that again in 1972 with Nixon. And it also emphasized that the greater bombing would have caused a lot of damage to their ability to support the war in the South. And again, McNamara gets this completely wrong, but that would have been a benefit as well. And then, of course, you could also combine it with going to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. There were a lot of big strategic opportunities missed.
I think we just have a couple more left. With all the newly released information in the past 10 years, how do we avoid talking about the Vietnam War from a revisionist point of view? And I think you just touched on this. And how would you navigate these waters as an academic historian?
It's yeah, I think there's still a pretty, I'd say, toxic environment in academia when it comes to Vietnam and a number of other topics. So, and I know younger scholars who are studying Vietnam are kind of told by their professors that the revisionist view of Vietnam is kind of politically incorrect, and if you want to succeed in this profession, you should probably stay away from it. And now what you do here, so the few sort of in the mainstream academic world will take it on. There are others who are, a lot of the revisionist scholars are people who are not even in academia. And it is something people have to be very mindful of. Now, some people are saying, well, we're now in the, phase where we're past this sort of revisionist versus orthodox debate. I think that's a lot of that is questionable. And I think we still have, there's now, and my last two books contain a lot of really big challenges to the orthodox view, and the revision, or the orthodox historians, for the most part, have ignored them. There's a book of essays called Triumph Revisited on the first volume, and there were some critiques of the book, but most of them were on very minor points, and some of the biggest issues, like, is the domino theory valid, or was U.S. military strategy valid, or could the U.S. have cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail? I mean, those things get ignored, and so people are reluctant to admit they were wrong, which of course isn't necessarily all that surprising, but it is it's certainly disappointing to see the academic climate where people are unwilling to be open-minded, and B, will to punish people or refuse to give people jobs because they don't have, conform to some sort of ideological position.
Another late question, Dr. Moyer. Do you think the greatest challenge the South Vietnamese government faced was the reality that it was more of a military junta than a government that represented the Vietnamese?
That's an argument that's been made, but I like to point out that, first of all, the North Vietnamese government was a small, narrow elite, and probably even more autocratic than that in the South. So I think that the mere fact that it was not democratic is really not a big deal. And there's not a tradition of democracy in Vietnam that would make it really important that you have a more democratic form. And it's also worth looking at the South Korean example, because South Korea was probably more autocratic and more corrupt than South Vietnam during the Korean War, and yet look where they are today. And I think Vietnam being culturally similar, I think we could have seen that sort of evolution, but you need peace to achieve that. But I think if you were to go to Vietnam now and say, would you rather look like South Korea or look like communist Vietnam, I'm pretty sure they would all say we'd rather be like South Korea. So yeah, I don't think that was a factor.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Moyer. We certainly really appreciate your talk and learned a lot of good information here. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming out and joining us this afternoon as well. We greatly appreciate all of our attendees, every single book talk that we have. I would recommend everybody go to our website, wisvetsmuseum.com, and look at our upcoming events. We'd love to see everybody come back for more of our virtual events. And we also have some in-house events coming up, such as next month, we have our popular Mess Night series coming back in April. So we'd like to see everybody come out for that. But thank you again for joining us today. And Dr. Moyer, thank you once again for presenting this information. We look forward to your third installment of this trilogy coming out.
Well, thanks so much. And I should say too, I really wrote this book for Vietnam veterans more than anyone else, because they've gotten, I think, really a raw deal from history. So encourage you all to read it. And there's also a Victor Davis Hanson review and podcast I would suggest to your viewers, because those have gotten a lot of attention, and please spread the word as well.